The Chief Technical Officer at PSMA, or used to be called Public Sector Mapping Agency, but PSMA would be its brand, Australia Limited, is Joseph Abhayaratna. And Joe is focused on emerging data management and distribution practices to support PSMA's continuing technology innovation. Joe is also co-chair of the Open Geospatial Consortium's Domain Working Group for Smart Cities and Citizen Science, and the co-chair of the Open Geospatial Consortium's Australia and New Zealand Forum. Please welcome Joe to the floor.
So today I'm not actually going to talk about standards. Hopefully don't throw tomatoes at me or anything like that. It's also not a technical conversation. It's actually a conversation about building communities. And I think its application to standards is incredible. And we have a lot of potential to do some great things if we're able to build a collaborative environment for us to work together and work toward the outcomes that we all want to achieve. So that's what I'm not talking about. What I am talking about today is a concept called social architecture. And hopefully at the end of this conversation, for those who haven't already heard about it, it's going to be part of your vocabulary going forward. And then I'm going to talk about an example of, I guess, the collaborative environment that you can create when you intentionally use the concepts of social architecture, and then give you a feel for where this particular activity is up to. So, first thing, where's it come from? Has anyone heard of it before? Anyone want to shout out something? Yell it out, go. Ah, okay. just go, no, okay. So, anyone know or want to have a guess? Or not? Okay, so, it actually comes from social media. And typically we're talking about building communities. So when you think about building communities, there's a couple of different things where that's also universally applicable. Open source software development. This is something that we have to constantly try and keep communities engaged because people aren't getting paid to do the work necessarily. Maybe they'll get some money in terms of consulting over the top of it, but they've got to take a leap of faith, and that leap of faith is something that we need to be able to find incentives to encourage. Open knowledge is another good example. Things like Wikipedia, meetup.com, these are also sort of, I guess, platforms for people to be able to share knowledge. But what incentivizes that? And that's where we're sort of interested. So Claudia Gatsby wrote an article in Huffington Post about this. I'm just going to read parts of this. So she defines social architecture as the conscious design of a social environment that encourages a range of behaviours leading toward a goal or a set of goals. And actually, it's devised as a response to fear of neglect in the actual real life communities. So that effectively, how do we build and plan that, those sorts of things? There's CSIRO, my colleagues in Australia at CSIRO have worked around a thing called the National Environmental Information Infrastructure. And when they went about doing that, effectively what they're trying to do is bring together systems and join up data from Commonwealth agencies like the Bureau of Meteorology, Geoscience Australia, some citizen science sort of programs, as well as states and territories where this information is held. And what they realised was that a majority of the resources, whether it's the technical systems or the people from the NEII, actually weren't owned and managed from a single organisation. And so because it's a whole bunch of people from different sort of organisations with different management practices and different cultures, they weren't able to apply direct control over those resources. And so you can't actually just use standard management practices. You have to try and rely on something else, something that's going to drive behaviours inside these communities toward outcomes. And so they did a bit of research and they wrote a paper describing the use of social architecture for the NEII. and they kind of broke it up into three things, and it's a bit of a rowing analogy. So for those rowers here, hopefully you can see yourself somewhere in this picture in one of the communities that you engage in. But ultimately there's a set of governance that I guess these are kind of like what are the practices, what is the culture, those sorts of things. They need to be deliberately built, and that's kind of around what they refer to as steering. So somebody's got to steer the boat, lead it in the right direction. Participation, which is about the rowing, the actual doing of the activities that need to get done. Otherwise, there's no point steering something if you're not moving. And in the course of doing that, you need to understand what are the rules of the game. If someone's going to yell out stroke, then you've got to push the oars and get the boat moving. So I guess these are around what are the rules for participation, how does that work? Without that, then there's just chaos, and this is the difference between chaos and getting people moving in the right direction. So what does participation look like? Well, there's a few things that they came up with, and in fact documented in that paper. One is that you need a common agenda, a common vision, and potentially a series of people who put that vision together. Without that, you kind of you can steer the ship, but you don't know where you're supposed to be. So it's difficult. It's like getting into a car and going, all right, let's get there, but we don't know where there is. So how do you do that? Common metrics for measuring whether or not you're moving in the right direction. Mutually reinforcing activities. So this is a very core component, which is why I underlined it. Participant incentives must be geared toward the outcomes that you're trying to get to. And I'll talk through that in the example as to how we were able to move in that direction in this particular example. Continuous communication. There's a lot of different organisations, and if you're not constantly communicating, then how do you know that you're moving in the right directions? How do you notice change so that you can steer it back into the correct sort of direction? Sustainable economics. So this is something that we struggle with, I think, a bit in lots of different communities. If it's really easy when money is not a difficulty, and I guess in the open source communities, this is a really common problem. A lot of projects are competing. And if dollars go to one particular project and not the other, then the sustainable economics to keep that community engaged and moving doesn't add up, and as a result they disappear overnight. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's not. And strong leadership. So to talk through the example I'm going to talk through is a thing called the linked data demonstrator, and this is an activity that kind of spun out of the Cooperative Research Centre for Spatial Information. So there's a paper that was put together in March 2017 called Towards a Spatial Knowledge Infrastructure. So this was a paper that came out of programs 2 and 3, which is Rapid Spatial Analytics and Spatial Infrastructures. And it espouses the publication of linked data among other things. So basically here's some cool stuff that you can do if publishers were publishing data as linked data. And I took over as the chair of the Program 3 board in around the same time as the paper was published. And one of the things that I did was I wanted to evaluate what are the barriers to utilisation. So we undertook an evaluation shortly after I took over as the chair. And one of the outcomes of that was that there was a recognised need to invest in some of the activities that were holding the program back. And some of that was that there was an assumption that the web of data existed and was accessible, and there was proper incentives to participate in that web of data. And so we challenged that and said, well, we may need to actually give that a bit of a boost to be able to get some high value data into this web of data to incentivise other people connecting to it. So I promised this wasn't going to be a technical discussion, so I'm not going to cover too much of that off. But one of the things that was identified in that was we need to bootstrap this spatial knowledge infrastructure. We need to do it with some high value data, and it needs to have links to other data, and that sort of promotes the concepts that Program 3 were talking about. And then we can take demonstrators and some of the research that was done inside Program 3 and demonstrate it over data that was updated, published and regularly maintained by its providers. So we came up with effectively three high-value data sets. The geocoded national address file, tapping into some of the stuff that Mike was talking about. That's Australia's addressing file for geocoded address. PSMA's administrative boundaries, so this is sort of like your locality regions, your local government areas, and the ABS is the Australian Statistical Geographic Standard. Marcus will correct me if I get that wrong. Don't throw anything at me, Marcus. But and so there's a series of different people. So the participants includes the ABS and PSMA as the data providers of these two data sets. We've got to host these things, and I'll talk through that in a sec. But we've got to host them. We need to get hosting providers into the mix as well. We've also got to show what's cool about this stuff, because I think there's still a little bit of I'm not sure about linked data. And so the CRCSI have a whole bunch of different demonstrators and a whole bunch of research that builds on top of linked data. They're an obvious candidate to be able to build demonstrators and show what the value of their research is. And then there's a series of experts as well. Not everyone knows everything about this stuff. And there's a whole bunch of people like CSIRO, like the Australian Government Linked Data Working Group, which is effectively a series of government agencies who are promoting the use of linked data and helping other organisations publish it. Rob Atkinson, who a lot of you will know, and the Centre for Spatial Data Infrastructures and Land Administration in the University of Melbourne. So what are their incentives? I talked about incentives, and I guess when we talk about participation, the things that are sort of going to guarantee good participation or solid participation are when you have a series of incentives, and for everything that you have to participate in, there's also barriers to participation. And so you can think of it as a scale. And I wish I had a diagram. I don't know why I didn't put this diagram in, but let's imagine that the incentives were one end of the scale and the disincentives were on the other end of the scale. Where are we going to get participation? We're going to get it when there's a solid tier of incentives to participate as opposed to the disincentives. And for everything, you might think that there may not be disincentives, but you've always got to give time, you've always got to give money. There's always something that's a barrier to participation, so we've got to overcome those. So for these particular people, we basically brought a group together and workshopped in Canberra, and we thought, okay, well, let's get some money aside and let's see if we can incentivise through money. But the fact of the matter is, the participants in terms of the data providers, hosting providers, demonstrator, developers and experts, it wasn't about necessarily direct investment in these activities. It was about what they could get from investing their time in these activities. For the providers, we want to test the hypothesis. Everyone's telling us linked data is this thing, you should totally get into it. And I guess there's a few skeptics in both of our organisations that really need to be convinced that that's actually true. And so this is an opportunity for us to test the hypothesis with a fairly low investment. It's just a people investment and some data that's already available and open. In terms of the hosting providers, they have a capacity to be able to demonstrate their ability to host things. But some people want to be considered for being a release authority of government data. Some of them already have services that they want to be able to promote the use of, and this is an opportunity for them, I guess, to advertise their credentials in those spaces. And in fact, there's quite a few people. It almost was like a fighting match as to where we were going to host it, which was what I wasn't expecting. I was thinking, geez, I'm going to have to find some cash for this. But as it turned out, they were fighting for the right to host it. Same thing, I kind of discussed the CRC activity. That there's a capability here to be able to demonstrate the research. But one of the other benefits with this being something that's a production system and supported by data providers is that once they're able to demonstrate the benefits, they can also say, here's something we provided over the top of existing data, and you can do this too. And it's one of the things, I think, with their previous research, they had to actually build the data assets that they were sort of communicating their stories over. And the issue is that those aren't real things. They're not maintained by other people. And so someone else picking up the research then has to deal with the fact that those assets aren't available or won't live beyond the life of a project. So I think it's a really important part of their activities to be able to say, this is built over something that already exists, you can do it too. But we also, from the community, we also need those sexy demonstrators. Otherwise it's just a whole bunch of linked data and it's not really exciting without something that sort of draws attention to it. And the experts, they've been talking about linked data for a long time. They've been building a whole bunch of sort of pilots and that kind of thing. But really the ability to demonstrate and solidify their capability and expertise with something that lives beyond what they're doing is a huge part of what they want to be able to do. And so they've come along for the journey, also providing their consulting and stuff like that free of charge. So what's working? Like I said, we got together in a workshop, and we basically, in that, developed this common agenda, common vision, and it was pretty clear to us that we actually didn't need to provide dollars. Everyone had something that end vision was going to deliver outcomes for. So we sort of had this very solid participation model, or incentives to participate. In terms of common metrics, we're kind of measuring, well, who's using it. We can publish it, but if we don't know who's using it and that it's being used, then like, who cares? That's the so what, I think, if someone would ask me. The mutual reinforcing activities, we've got organisational support, which is quite high in different organisations as a result of what I just mentioned. As a result of that, volunteerism is quite high. So if anyone takes a length of time to do anything, someone else jumps in and actually does it. And so occasionally I've been a bit sidetracked by some stuff happening at work at the moment, and some personal challenges that I've had over the last couple of weeks. A couple of activities were waiting for me. People were nudging me over and over and over again, and then next thing you knew, I wasn't checking my emails for 2 days, come in and someone had done the work that I was supposed to do, and also essentially just sent me something saying, can you check this? I checked it, looks good, and everyone else moved on. So it's been a really, really solid volunteering environment. There's high use of existing technologies. People have sort of open sourced some of the work that they've done, which may have been behind closed doors before, in order to get this project moving. So again, in terms of mutually reinforcing activities and volunteerism, it's very strong. Whilst the leadership is not a single person standing out front, it's fairly shared leadership, it's still very solid, and that's largely owing to the fact that the agenda is incredibly clear to the people in the room, and they're all moving in the same direction. So we haven't had to rely upon anyone dictating anything within that group. And to be fair, it's really difficult to do that inside this environment where it's opt-in. So there's lots of good news, but see, here's some bad news. So communication's not been as great as it could have been, and that's largely because, actually, of the second one. I'm probably going to do the second one first. I should have thought about this. So the first one is the sustainable economics. All of our budgets were set before we moved into this activity. We identified this activity after we'd set our budgets for the year. So there's no money, extra money available. So we've got to try and get this done on the smell of an oily rag. And how we're doing that is, like I mentioned before, because people have got outcomes that they want to get out of it, and it's working quite well from that perspective. But the issue there is that we're not able to gain access to extra resources outside of that group. And where that hits us is when we've got to get in and get stuff done, there's no one else to take over and someone else to communicate what's going on. So the same people are doing the work as who's communicating what's happening, and sometimes we've had our head down doing stuff and not had our head ups making the communication happen. And that's caused a couple of problems for us throughout the course of this, in terms of, hang on, where are you guys up to? We're trying to do this bit, we're depending on that information, and we haven't got it. So I'm not going to pretend like we've got that one right. And I've covered that one already. So where's it up to? Here's a whole bunch of things. Some of those are technical things, so I don't necessarily want to get into them unless you want to ask me questions about them in question time. I'll come back to the slide and talk through them. If you can see the italicized bits, so extend the APIs and software, create missing vocabularies, identify UI patterns, establish agreements, publish data. Some of those things are still underway. So this is the activities that are either started or completed, and the italicized ones are the ones completed. Sorry, are the ones not completed. So we're quite far along the path. Actually, we've already got a whole bunch of the data sets created. Now it's just about getting the necessary environment to host them. So in terms of what's next, we've got to complete the current work items. We've got to hand over the demonstrator to the developers. To hand over to the Demonstrator developers. So we've had one workshop with them to show them what's been built. And there's a little bit of excitement in the room, so it's quite good that that's happened. We've also been talking through the Australian Government Linked Data Working Group, where there's a whole bunch of people who are sort of saying, when's it ready, when's it ready, when's it ready, how do I speed it up? And so some of those people, again, have also opted in to try and help with the publication tasks. So again, it's a very solid volunteering environment, but we've still got to do the handover. We haven't completed it yet. We'll do that after we've completed. There's a lot of people asking for problem and solution patterns. So as we go across this this task, there's a whole bunch of things which people who have done, even people who have actually done publication of linked data before, so people like the Ordnance Survey, they've they're further along in terms of publication, but they would probably identify things that they did or that they're having troubles with in terms of uptake that they're not sure how to resolve. And so we're sharing some of our knowledge in terms of, here are some of the impediments that we see, here are some of the conditions that we have in Australia that have helped overcome some of those issues, and maybe these will help you with your particular linked data activities. But some of these problem and solution patterns will refer to things that are not linked data related. They may refer to things like, if I need to choose a web address for a particular thing, or how do I determine who has the rights or mandates, or who has de facto control over publication, or it's probably, I guess it's probably hard to see some of these, but some of these problems span beyond what we're actually doing in this activity. But if we can identify and describe them generically, we can then provide something that someone can look at and say, hey, look, I actually want to publish a data set, even if it's just spatial data that I'm publishing on the web. This is something that I can use to apply. Here's the necessary decision bodies. Here's how I apply something like ISO 19135, the registry, the processes for managing registries. How do I apply those? When does it apply to me? We're also wanting to, the spatial data on the web interest group within W3C has kicked off, and they've got a series of best practices that were built during the spatial data on the web working group. We're providing feedback on some of those because it's a task that's actually directly attributable to this activity. And so this is kicked off. In fact, there's a meeting tomorrow morning, so we'll be dialing in and providing a whole bunch of these particular patterns to them and some feedback on some of those best practices. We're also here in New Zealand, I guess, talking to the people in New Zealand and saying, this is something that we've done in Australia. Is it something that attracts you to do in New Zealand? So we've kind of talked about it as something that they might be interested in the future, but showing them something and letting them touch and feel it's a very, very key part of being able to test whether they want to get engaged as well. And we have other things as well that are still on the backlog. We kind of drew a line and said, this is what we're going to deliver as part of this activity. And so these other things are sort of waiting until we've finished the work that we're doing now. So I think that this social architecture concepts, this concept of how do you create communities and stuff like that, is broadly applicable. It's not just broadly applicable to standards and the publication of linked data and all that kind of thing. I think it's going to be a big part of the way that we do business in the future. So I'm hoping that you can kind of get a feel for what's possible. I mean, this was I thought at the start of this that we'd have to get funding up front to get any of this work done. We still require the funding. We've got to try and show off what's cool about the stuff that we're building. But what we've actually been able to accomplish in bringing a group together and creating this collaborative environment is kind of quite compelling to say this is something that can be applied more broadly. So I guess what I want to be able to do with that is to demonstrate with that example what the benefits of understanding what incentives are, outlining how, and taking a targeted approach to how you go about putting activities and moving those activities into a production environment. And I wanted to give you an update on this particular task. If anyone's interested in the task or has questions about the task, please come and see me or give me a shout now. And that's it. Cool.
Questions?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, I'm inviting questions of Joe.
Kia Kia ora, Joe. I'm Alison Stringer from As of Today Statistics New Zealand.
Hello.
Great concept. So what we often find with working collaboratively is it's very dependent on key people within organisations. And I'm just wondering if your approach is a more sustainable approach that doesn't quite rely so much on your key, extraordinarily useful people and has a little bit built-in succession and even some functional redundancy.
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. There's two parts to that question. In this particular instance, I would say it's still dependent on people, and I think this is largely a problem of, I guess it's the problem space that we're working in. So the concept of linked spatial data, there's not a huge number of people that are broadly across it. I think that if you were to look at open source communities and some of the other communities that these sorts of things have been applied to, I would say it is a really sustainable way of doing it. But yeah, I can't say that this particular activity is a good example of that. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
Right. Well, please thank Joe for his contribution. Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Brian.
Joe, I might just answer a bit to that question from New Zealand Stats. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a linked data, central government agencies in Australia are participating in a linked data trial through that records project. Mm-hmm. So our National Archives, the Prime Minister and Cabinet and Finance Department are participating in a trial, not around spatial data, but around records. So it's a general information management application. But so we have other activities occurring within the government. It's kind of low level and exploratory. So that's happening as well in terms of where do you find the resources and acknowledgement that this could be part of government business in the future. But what Joe didn't perhaps explain is there is a small body of renegades within the government. It's actually
That's normal.
and included, and what they've done is set up a informal charter where we can set up some governance around linked data activity, particularly for government. And we're trying to, we've approached CIOs from a number of key departments, and we're starting to get the CIOs on board as well. So I've got a verbal confirmation from my CIO, who's the Prime Minister and Cabinet being the kind of nominal head of government in Australia, that he's very interested in what this is all about, that he's willing to explore this further and take it somewhat further in a formalised sense. So and I think a number of other CIOs have informally signed up to this. We're going to get that in writing so that we have a bit more support when we go for the big bang approach, I guess, and roll this out. So there is some organisation, albeit led from a bunch of, I guess, informal, very dedicated people within government.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. Cool. Please thank Joe for his presentation this morning. Thank you very much, Joe.